U.S. and Russian military delegations are beginning talks in Geneva this week to find ways to ease tensions amidst Russian military action in eastern Ukraine and deadly protests in Kazakhstan. The New York Times reports Russia has about 100,000 troops stationed along Russia's border with Ukraine. Russia's blamed the escalating tensions over Ukraine on Western powers. On Friday, the U.S. and NATO rejected Russian demands that the alliance not admit new members amidst growing concerns that Russia may invade Ukraine, which seeks to join NATO. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said today security negotiations between Russia and the West could provide a pathway to avoid further conflict.
These are important efforts to try to make sure that we have a political solution, that we prevent an armed conflict, and therefore we are going into these talks in good faith, ready to address substance, and of course ready to listen to Russia's concerns. I have negotiated with Russia before as a Norwegian Prime Minister, and I know it's possible to make deals with Russia.
This comes as Kazakhstan's authoritarian president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, has described last week's protest as an attempted coup and defended his call for Russian-led troops into the country to put down the unrest. Demonstrations were triggered by a rise in fuel prices and widened to broader anti-government protests. Over 160 people were killed in the violence, including a 4-year-old girl. Thousands were detained. Tokayev spoke today at a virtual meeting with the Russian-led CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization military alliance.
We prevented dangerous threats for the country's security. As part of the counter-terrorist mission, we are trying to identify people who committed those crimes. We detained around 8,000 people, and law enforcement officers and special departments are checking their involvement in terrorist acts, murders, lootings, and other crimes.
A state of emergency and a nationwide curfew remain in place in Kazakhstan. One of the leaders of the opposition movement called Democratic Choice of Kazakhstanis is the country's former energy minister and bank chairman, Mukhtar Ablyazov. He fled to the UK in 2009 after he was charged with corruption, embezzling $6 billion as head of Kazakhstan's largest bank. He's called on the West to get more involved in responding to the protests.
If Europe and the U.S. don't deceive themselves by thinking that it's just a small task force, then they will react the right way. If not, then Kazakhstan will turn into Belarus, and Putin will methodically impose his program, the recreation of a structure like the Soviet Union.
For more, we're joined in Moscow by Nina Khrushcheva, professor of international affairs at the New School, co-author of In Putin's Footsteps, Searching for the Soul of an Empire Across Russia's 11 Time Zones. She's also the author of The Lost Khrushchev, Journey into the Gulag of the Russian Mind. She's the great-granddaughter of the former Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Professor Khrushcheva. Can you first talk about... Can you talk about what's happening right now in Geneva, the talks between Russia and the United States, and then talk about what's happening in Ukraine?
Thank you, Amy. Happy New Year to all the listeners. It starts in a very tense, with a very tense environment, certainly around Russia. What we are told in Geneva that we will know the results of the first day, actually the second day, because the first meeting, the preliminary meeting was in dinner yesterday. We were told that the deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, would be speaking later and explaining what has happened. But so far, what I've read, the Russians have been saying that they're not going to make any concessions. And if there are any concessions to be made, it should be the Americans, because according to the Russian side, the Americans are the ones that are threatening, or NATO is something that is threatening Russian security. So far, we are only hearing that diplomacy and conversations are possible, but it doesn't seem, at least what we're hearing now, that there are any breakthroughs, although we were told by both Secretary Blinken and the Russian side that they're not expecting the breakthroughs immediately or maybe even later on, but we will see. As for Ukraine, it is a little bit of a complicated story because it's very unclear exactly what the Russian idea is to have all these troops on the border with Ukraine. I am not of a school of thought that is especially, I mean, I know that is prevalent in the United States, that Putin is going to invade Ukraine. I think it is a bit of an information attack, as the United States kept saying, especially that all the media and quoting Blinken and quoting Victoria Nuland, who's responsible for Russia and Eurasia, saying that, if and so, and we think that they will invade and therefore we'll punish them in this very severe manners. Russians are keeping the troops, from my point of view, as they say, to prevent potential Ukraine government encouraged by the West and the Western military support from trying to take the territories annexed in 2014 by force. And I'm actually tending to trust Putin on that, because I don't think he wants a large bloodshed. I don't think he wants to take Kiev, as many analysts have been, American analysts have been suggesting. I think for him, that's his own information, of course, being Russian, it should be with the tanks as well, but his own information and kind of psychological campaign that if the West, you are not listening to us, we have other options to consider. Unfortunately, it could be a military one.
And explain the history of U.S. promises to Russia around the not expanding NATO.
Well, that's it's kind of, there's a lot of debate going on about this. Apparently, James Baker in 1990 talking with then Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, did say that Russia wouldn't push 1 inch beyond the current borders. Then the question, of course, they were talking about East Germany and unification of Germany after '89, after the war. The Berlin
You're saying
wall,
that NATO
fell.
wouldn't push 1 inch.
Right. Sorry. Yes, NATO wouldn't push 1 inch. But they were talking about East Germany, that it wouldn't go further. And actually, we're seeing that Germany, in fact, keeps that promise. So it is questionable that they may have meant the whole NATO expansion, but maybe they only meant Germany. I think the more important part is the conversation between Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, and Boris Yeltsin, when then it certainly was a promise that it wouldn't go, at least not in Yeltsin's time, as Clinton put it to Yeltsin. But of course, Yeltsin wasn't pleased, but he couldn't do anything at the time. And as we know, in '98, there was a decision by U.S. Congress that the expansion could happen. But once again, Clinton said it's not going to happen in your time. And so that's why the Russians now, when they're calling for the arrangement of '97, they talk about that very moment in 1998 when the U.S. Congress decided that NATO could expand.
So let me go to Secretary of State Tony Blinken speaking on ABC News Sunday, saying he doesn't expect progress in relations with Russia as long as tensions on the Ukraine border remain high.
If we're actually going to make progress in these talks, starting next week, but I don't think we're going to see any breakthroughs next week. We're going to listen to their concerns, they'll listen to our concerns, and we'll see if there are grounds for progress. But to make actual progress, it's very hard to see that happening when there's an ongoing escalation, when Russia has a gun to the head of Ukraine with 100,000 troops near its borders, the possibility of doubling that on very short order. So if we're seeing de-escalation, if we're seeing a reduction in tensions, that is the kind of environment in which we could make real progress and, again, address concerns, reasonable concerns on both sides.
So, Professor Khrushcheva, President Biden's made clear if President Putin makes any more moves and goes into Ukraine, Russia will pay a heavy price. They've talked about very high-level sanctions. What would those sanctions be? And do you think these threats are productive?
I don't think that. I think threats are never productive, and I actually think that Secretary Blinken, interestingly, is very undiplomatic when it comes to Russia. He almost talks about Russia as if it's North Korea and Putin is Kim Jong-un. I understand that they're angry because they were in charge in 2014. Russian annexation, in charge of preventing Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, and they really didn't do such a good job in stopping Putin then. So in many ways, it's a little bit of a payback. So I don't think threats are useful, and in fact, they're certainly never. And that's what Russians are trying. At least Putin's message is just stop threatening us, stop lecturing us, stop telling us that we're inferior species, and talk to us. And that's why he has those troops around the Ukrainian border. It's like, well, if you're not understanding it any other way, this is how we are going to make ourselves heard. I don't know if Putin's techniques are very, very useful either, but essentially, in some ways, in Russia, for example, it's very much compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis right now, that when two sides were giving each other ultimatums, and the expectation was who would blink first. And so far, I'm not seeing that either side is ready to blink, because Putin is not going to take off, at least not in large numbers, to take down the troop location around Ukraine until he hears something from America, and America is not going to do anything until Putin does something to reduce the troop levels. The sanctions could be insane and dramatic, and that's why another thing. I don't believe that Putin wants to escalate that much. I believe it's not that he wants to take more territory. I think he wants to get heard. In fact, Dmitry Trenin, the director of the Carnegie Center here in Moscow, wrote a really interesting and very level-headed article in Foreign Affairs, which I invite the listeners to look into. So far, the SWIFT system, Russians are being threatened with taking it down, maybe close borders, maybe stop Aeroflot, the Russian national airline, to fly to the United States. Maybe, I forgot, there are some other, sanction any, not just the Putin, Putin environment, people give them very, very tough sanctions, but the whole industries per se, and so they will not be functional at all. So the damage can be dramatic for sure, and that's why I think both sides are, for now, staring at each other and waiting for who will blink first.
I want to turn to Kazakhstan. Over 160 protesters have been killed. The president there, Tokayev, calls them terrorists. Many are being held right now. Can you explain what's happening, and then Russia's involvement?
That's such a complicated story. I actually also want to say that, unfortunately, once again, when it comes to kind of Russia, immediate vicinity of Russian territory, the most reporting is a little shorthand, because, first of all, Tokayev is not, it is an authoritarian system, but Tokayev himself was a second hand to the previous president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who left some years ago, installed Tokayev as president, but basically it was Nazarbayev who was running the country. So what happened was, and it was reported correctly, that there were gas prices that were shot up, especially in the north of the country, and that's where oil and gas not offices, but production systems are in place, and so people really went out with economic demands, but also then political demands. They were not protesting against Tokayev. They were protesting against Nazarbayev mostly, because the family system, his family runs everything, and they were screaming, old man, go away, old man, go away. And then that was used by forces close to Nazarbayev, because they were afraid that his power is diminishing, and efforts to perhaps take out Tokayev. And so he was forced or decided, or maybe was advised to invite the Russian peacekeeping because, when the Russian troops go in, and we haven't had reports that the Russian troops were doing any military exercises, but they were certainly as a heavy, kind of a heavy message that if the country doesn't come down, then the Russians would get involved. But so far, we were told that they would stay there for a week or a little longer. So it doesn't seem that Putin, although a very lucky man, I mean, he clearly didn't plan it, but suddenly he's something that everybody says he wants to have. That is, he have all the spheres of influence that the Soviet Union used to have. Here he is getting his sphere of influence just because it happened this way. So what I predict and what I think would happen is that the Russian troops will probably get out. But Tokayev, if he keeps power, and it looks like he might keep power at least for some time, probably will be somehow in depth of Putin, and Putin may have position to decide or help decide certain moves in Kazakhstan.
And how were U.S. oil companies like Chevron and ExxonMobil able to gain so much influence on the post-Soviet state of Kazakhstan, making the country one of the largest oil producers in the region? And what power do they have now?
Well, I'm not an expert on Kazakhstan. I can only talk about Putin more or less confidently. But what I know is that, I mean, one of the reasons that it's actually probably a very unfortunate moment for the West, because they, from the numbers I had, I looked at about 350 billion was invested in those industries. And so if Putin has a political and economic say in Kazakhstan, then it would be infinitely difficult for them to function and sort of not take Russia into account. But one of the things about Nazarbayev, and that's why I said that those reports on Russian involvement in Kazakhstan, or he was a Russian, Tokayev or Nazarbayev were Russian-backed presidents, it's not true. One of the things that Nazarbayev was able to do is to create his own space, his own country. And every time when Putin would say, well, we were, you didn't even exist before the Soviet Union, Nazarbayev would be very firm in responding that this is our country, you don't have a say in it. So he kept Russia at bay, and he was welcoming all the investments in the past. And so the question now is what it's those investments, how it's going to play out in the future.